All right, everybody, come on in, come on in. Welcome, 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 welcome. My name is Hannah Norberg, and I am the proud president and the initiator of the TradeExperettes. If I haven't had the honor of meeting you before, just going to give people a second to come in. We had some technical challenges, but we are all here now. And so I am calling in from Copenhagen today. And it's a beautiful spring day if you love rain and storm, if that's what you enjoy. So we're just gonna see, because I know that there was people waiting, but we're all coming in and the chat's here. Yes. Hello, Yana. So she's organizing all of this. So I'm just going to get us started because there's so much to say here, and this is being recorded. So for those of you who are joining and are catching up, you can always catch us up later. So welcome to the third part in this curated series on supply chains. This is a conversation. This is for bridging the gap in conversations between private sector and public sector and issues regarding to supply chains. This is a series that we have been running since November of 2024, and the first one was moderated by our advisor Penny Nast, and that was one that was about how supply chains work and why they are so complicated, and if they are really a chain or a web, actually. And then earlier this year, our other advisor, Darcy Vetter, had a really interesting conversation on what regulations do and how they function and why we have them. And finally, it's my turn today to take a look at what the actual role is for tech in supply chains. We're going to be looking a little bit at what tech can do and what it does do, and the role it plays in enabling and supporting both the development and sustainability and transparency in global supply chains, on how it can help us, make sure that we fulfill the rules and regulations, as well as what issues even the very best tech in the world cannot solve. And we also want to make sure that we pull out some of what policymakers should know about this and what they can do to support tech in supply chains. I have a fantastic lineup today. I'm really proud of it. I'm really excited about it. The people who are on here know that we've had to wrestle for a long time to get us all lined up on the same day. So first we have Emmanuelle Gan. She is her new title at the WTO is Chief of Digital Trade and Frontier Technology. And then we have Jeff Weiss, who is a partner at Steptoe. It's a law firm in Washington, D.C., and the chair of the ASTM International F49 Standards Committee on Digital Information in the Supply Chain. And I just love that level of nerdery. So the ASTM is a U.S. standards organization. And then we have Abba Schubert, who is a CEO and co-founder of Dory. And she's also a WEF Global Innovation and Tech Pioneer. So this is a third part of a webinar series, and there will also follow a write-up. And we're doing this with a very generous support from PepsiCo and from Global Affairs Canada. And we're going to do this in three parts. So we're going to start off with a round of where are we now? And then we're going to move to what trade can and can't do. And then we're going to do it where we can and we could go from here and what it will take. And my favorite type of webinar has a lot of interaction. So the only thing that we know with this webinar is that we will be running out of time. There's no doubt about that. So make sure that you start, as soon as you start thinking of your comments or questions, start posting them in the chat box so that all the speakers can see them and we can tackle them as we go. A good way of warming up there is to actually get in the chat box in the beginning and just say, hey, I'm coming in from, in my case, Copenhagen today. And so without further ado, I'm going to start us off with Emmanuel. I'm going to give you the floor to give you, if you could open things up for us for a little bit on where we are now.
Sure, with pleasure. And thank you, Hannah, for organizing this this webinar on technology. So where are we now? Now, for most of modern trade history, supply chains were really built on physical infrastructure. So think roads, ports, warehouses. And efficiency was really measured in terms of number of containers that are being moved or days in transit. And technology until recently was mainly used to optimize logistics within a company or sector. So barcodes, for example, or ERP systems. But what we've seen really over the past, I would say 2-3 decades is something fundamentally, a fundamental change that has happened. The global supply chains have become not just a chain of goods, but more like a web of data, where digital tools are now like the connecting tissue of global trade in modern supply chains, making them more transparent, resilient, and sustainable. So you have technologies like blockchain, for example, that enable end-to-end visibility, enhancing transparency, and making it possible to trace products along the entire supply chain. You have AI and digital twins that can simulate disruptions and help reroute or reallocate resources in quasi real time, enhancing supply chain resilience. And you have IoT sensors, for example, that can monitor emissions, that can monitor working conditions in real time, and enhancing sustainability and compliance. And this shift has really accelerated in recent years because of, I would say, 4 factors. The first one is the tech factor itself. Now, we know that technology has been reshaping international trade for centuries. But what is really special today is what I call the triple ace dimension of this tech factor: speed, scale, and synergy. Speed, you have a succession of new technologies, blockchain, AI, quantum computing that is around the corner. Scale, we saw global adoption of AI almost overnight, like we hadn't seen before. And synergy, because the various digital technologies that are reshaping global trade are really reinforcing each other. So IoT devices and sensors, for example, when they're combined with the secure transmission capabilities of DLT and the analytical capabilities of big data analytics enabled by AI, are able to deliver truly meaningful and actionable information that's much more valuable than when they are used on their own. And this is very often what I call the tech cocktail. You know, when you want to do a cocktail, you don't use just one ingredient. It's great to use several. With technology, it's the same. It's best to use several technologies in sync if you want to have a better outcome. So that's the first factor. The second factor is really the rise of globalization of production, which requires more coordination across borders. Third factor, major disruptions. Of course, COVID has significantly accelerated digitalization, but you also have some climate shocks, etc., that have really exposed the fragility of opaque and real-time supply chains. And the last factor is the fact that there are new regulatory demands, especially around sustainability, human rights, carbon accountability, from Europe's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive to CBAM, the US Uyghur Forced Labor Preventive Act, or all the discussions around digital product passports, for example. So the bar has really been rising in recent years. And companies must now prove where and how products are made. They must account for emissions, not just in their operations, but across the entire value chains. And in this context, technology has moved from a nice to have to a must have. But, and we will come back to it later, I know technology is not a magic bullet, but nevertheless, it's a critical enabler for transparency, resilience, and sustainability. But it's not just about compliance. I talked about regulations. It's also about efficiency and inclusiveness. It can significantly lower trade costs, and that's particularly important for small and medium-sized enterprises. And I've been working on small businesses for a long time, so this is dear to my heart. And this is something that we hear on a very regular basis, the importance of digitalization for small businesses. So if there's one message that I want to convey is that technology is no longer just like a support tool for supply chain. It's really becoming the architecture on which resilient, sustainable, and rules-based trade must be built. And so the challenge is not so much whether to adopt the technology, but how to deploy it in a way that is interoperable, that is inclusive, that is adaptable to the evolving policy landscape. And this is where collaboration between the private and public sector and between global and national body becomes critical. But I think we'll come back to it in the third part that you mentioned in your introductory remarks. So let me stop here.
Fascinating. And I was just thinking about that, like when we deploy a new technology, now that we don't even think about it, like AI is in our emails already. So it's not like we have to go get that machine and get that in. So it just seamlessly. Well, Abba, so you're obviously very passionate about this. You've given your life to this, right? And to solving these issues. So I was wondering if you could talk us through a little bit of, what this looks like for you in your everyday setup, and what sort of issues, what people are coming to you for.
Yeah. And I'd say, at Dory, we serve mostly smaller and mid-sized businesses. So that's the perspective with which I'm the most familiar. And, of course, that does make up a big portion of global value chains. So I tend to see people focusing on issues that fall broadly into one of three categories. Risk management, which includes compliance; efficiency, along the lines of what Emmanuel was saying. I think this was probably the first stop for trade tech for a lot of business. And then the third category, I'll kind of call it angst. It's like the catch-all of what stresses people out, and they end up talking about with me. And for risk management, what we do is we help our customers capture key information about goods and processes along the entire life cycle, and then preserve that information in a way that it's accessible on a need to know and a when to know basis. For efficiency, it's basically using the same fundamental tools and enabling users to have ready access to their data for management information, for better decision making, and for just running their businesses as well as they can. And the theme across all of this is flexibility, because businesses are always evolving, especially rapidly growing businesses or smaller businesses. They're often grappling with slim margins or uneven kind of financial cycles and performance cycles. So they're always having to pivot, always having to change things up. And the ability of users of technology to easily reconfigure data capture and the way it's used is very valuable. So having your technology be able to fit in with constant tweaks to suppliers, constant tweaks to production processes, commercial relationships, you name it, that's really important and really useful. But there's this kind of, I hesitate to call it a zero-sum game, but it's a delicate balancing act between the flexibility of the technology you use and the difficulty and complexity of actually using it. So simple tools are easy to use. A hammer, you hit a nail with it. But you get like a Swiss Army knife, and where do you start? What do I use this one for? What do I use that one for? What if I want to use all three? It starts to be more complicated. You need a more sophisticated operator for a more complicated tool. And so that's a constant balance to strike, and is for me on a day-to-day basis, a driver of our strategy of, okay, in our user stories of kind of how we think people will actually be using our tools that we produce, how sophisticated are they? How much time do they have? Are they looking on a phone in a construction zone, or are they seated at a desk with time and peace and quiet to be reflective about what they have to do? So these are really tricky things to balance when you're producing a technology tool that can actually be used. Now, kind of pivoting a little bit to what I see changing at the moment, like I'd say the level of interest and engagement from businesses that aren't global juggernauts, that aren't the PepsiCos of the world, in the way that they're trying to find the right tech for their needs is ratcheting up. So historically, I've seen mid-scale and smaller businesses be very reactive in the way they use tech relating to trade. They tend to have pretty basic information management processes. And beyond that, their focus is on doing whatever they have to do to satisfy the big guy in the room with them. And that big guy can be a government body like a regulator, or it can be a key counterparty like the must-have customer for their sector, or a key supplier who they really have to work with and they have to keep them comfortable. So they historically have done a lot of focus on doing whatever they have to do to keep the big guy happy. They have to use whatever technology format and portal and system that big guy demands. So they firefight and they create little workflows and solutions around specific isolated needs. And they historically wouldn't necessarily dedicate resources to a broader technology strategy for trade or for anything outside their core production processes and where they get value. But I think this mindset has been changing over the last 5 to 10 years. And a couple of factors are driving it. Logistics, like Emmanuel mentioned, has really been a shining light in terms of using technology to improve efficiency, to manage risk, and just better. And that came really into focus during COVID when there were both logistics challenges and supply disruptions, which could be mitigated by good logistics if you could find them. Then also consumer sensitivity to environmental factors. I care about where the fiber in my jacket came from, and labor practices. That's been another factor, though less so than I think efficiency drivers. And then more recently, especially in Europe, again, as Emmanuel touched upon, the new rules like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the Corporate Transparency Directive, these are hard push mechanisms, not nice to haves. They're gotta do. And so I think I've talked a little bit about the efficiency and the risk management, but then the last category I mentioned was angst. And this is something I see changing, and it's a constantly in motion. And angst is my category for the things that people are worried about. They want to stay relevant. What are their competitors doing? And all of this, I think, has gone up a notch in the shadow of AI. I guess, what do we mean when we talk about AI? Means different things to different people, different applications across sectors and across functions. So these are a lot of issues that, for instance, I can't solve directly usually. And as people get acquainted with AI, they come to technology providers and they often expect magic. They'll kind of say like, make my back office stop making mistakes. And I'm like, well, we can't really just do that. We can talk about ways to improve the quality of your team's training. We can talk about reducing labor needs or changing labor needs. We can talk about increased automation to reduce errors and ways to flag up errors and stuff like that. But it takes a big unpacking, I think, and a lot of introspection on business processes to actually address some of these big questions that people knock on the door with. And a lot of the times they're not quite ready to do that. So it's kind of, come in with the big, what can AI do for me question, and then roll it back and get back to fundamentals of, what information do you have? Where does that come from? What do you think you want to do with it? What format is it in? So there, a lot of areas of focus, and some of them are changing. And I'd say all of that is kind of in the background in the last couple of months, in the trade universe, where everything's been thrown up in the air by new tariffs, by new export controls that are changing so rapidly. And that brings the focus back to flexibility, which is great to have, but sometimes people don't even have the timeline to adjust their technology to changes in rules. And then you get a real disincentive to investment in technology if people are like, I had an 18-month project that, implementation timeline that cost me, a huge amount of my budget, and now it doesn't work anymore because everything changed. So that's a big challenge right now. And I hope that the rapid changes in the landscape don't put people off of technology adoption. So I think on the note of a lot of legal machinations, Jeff, it's probably a good time to hand off to you.
Love that segue. How she just did that for me, Jeff.
Well, I mean, there's so much certainty in trade these days. Every time I do one of these webinars, I have to, when I at the end of the webinar, I'm not sure whether what I just said is still accurate. That seems to happen every time I do one of these. I feel like I'm going to violently agree with a lot of the things that have already been said in terms of traceability, use of technology for traceability in particular being a must-have these days, and also the use of multiple tools, technology tools. U.S. Customs would say it's a multi-layered approach, but I assume that many others would look at it similarly, maybe using different terminology. I would say that with the emerging trade landscape, and none of us know exactly where it's going to land. We just know we're in a period of flux. There are going to be differences in tariff treatment is going to be a much bigger deal. So I know with respect to USMCA in particular, a lot of companies didn't bother making sure they could document whether their products were USMCA compliant or not, because it didn't really matter that much. And now it does. The other thing is that the administration is saying, well, we're not going to give exceptions to any of these tariff regimes until they do. We know that that will happen. We're in discussions. The administration is very transactional. Whether there's a process or there is not a process, we're in discussions about phasing things in, phasing things out, import measures, export measures. There are going to be a multitude of rules. WTO is not part of the conversation at all. Economic security is national security, so everything is fair game. I often tell the story, I can't believe it's been this long, but so I was at USTR for a long time, but then I ended up at Commerce in the Secretary's office, and the last negotiation I did was G20 on digital economy, and this was about 10 years ago. And this is the first time we ever negotiated digital economy. And the way G20 goes, you're in a room. I was co-chairing it with, we were co-chairing it with China, and you have the U.S., China, various member states, Russia, EU, and we all have to agree within X number of months on free flow of data, privacy, and cybersecurity. These are things we just don't agree on. So, just going into that negotiation, I just knew this was going to be very painful. But I do remember lecturing the delegates from China and Russia about the dangers of relying on national security as a justification for trade measures, and that one should never do that because it was opening a Pandora's box. That was 2015. So at this point, the US delegate ought to just get up and sit down next to the Chinese and Russian delegates, because things have just changed so much here that we don't even think about it anymore. We just know that those are arguments that work. And the last administration they didn't necessarily move the ball forward in that direction, but they didn't roll it back either. So this is where we are. And as an advocate, these are the arguments I need to make. If I don't make these arguments, someone will make them because they resonate. So anyway, just going back to the topic, because I think that atmosphere is relevant. So we're going to see differences in tariffs. Those are going to be there. They're going to be very different depending on the context. We're also going to see more non-tariff measures, and some of those have been mentioned, content requirements in the US context, UFLPA, tax credits. So being able to trace your supply chain and bring the receipts, that's going to be even more important than before. There was just a class action filed in US District Court against a large coffee chain that I will not mention for use of forced labor in Brazil. Deforestation was mentioned as well. That frightened me, right? That if they didn't know, who actually knows what's going on? There's so much that companies don't know. I do a lot of due diligence work in critical minerals and batteries and solar and EV, 1,200 parts in some cases. You know, in one recent case, there was a subcontractor of a tier 3 supplier that was found to be using forced labor, and they supplied to numerous auto OEMs who all had to rip out and replace the part, but no one knew at the time. And I think CBP is still trying to figure out, do we actually want to see documents for every single part? Can we possibly do that? Especially, they're still using paper. They're still tracing these things, asking for documents. That's not going to last, especially with, again, in the US context, they're downsizing trade operations. So they're going to have to rely on technology if they're actually going to enforce all of these measures. So the ASTM committee that we started a couple of years ago, that actually was started to deal with the goods movement challenges that we faced in COVID, just understanding with all the congestion. And we're about to see that again now that things are restarting after the tariffs were removed from China. But, you know, where's my stuff? What's its condition? When's it going to get there? But now we're focused on the traceability aspects. And I have to tell you, it's a mess in terms of the terminology. There's so many different dictionaries for supply chain terms. And I know the WTO has been doing a lot of work in that space, which is super helpful. And I know in the US, you may have some of our large reports, you may have a dozen terminals all using different operating systems. So there's a lot of work we can do. There are a lot of bodies out there doing work in this space, including ASTM, including ISO and UNECE, and we try to use everything that's out there so that we're not reinventing the wheel. It's going to be very interesting to see how things evolve in this space, but I think conversations like this are going to be super helpful, and I can't wait to hear more about what Manuel and Abba are working on to see what else I can learn that I can bring back to the committee.
There's so much food for thought now. I'm assuming that we all feel like, where do we go next? So what I also, so thank you for like touching base on both of where we are now and what we can and can't do. I think one of the really important lessons from this series and from our very first episode was that people might not understand exactly what Jeff was saying, that 1,200 parts, and then there's just not one supplier for each of those parts. So a household name can have easily hundreds of thousands or even millions of suppliers. So it gets really busy. Now my next question is, what is like the coolest feature that you know? I mean, so once we drill it down to these details, right? There are always these questions of people think that you're working on one thing, but you're really working on something that's different. And there's something that you're really excited about. And then there are things that people think that you can't do that you can't do. You touched on that already, Abba. But let's do a round of that and then save us for where we can do and for the next one. So I'm just gonna throw it back to you, Jeff, I think.
Sorry, I needed to unmute myself. So in terms of what tech can't do, so you can't fix a problematic measure, right? So no matter No matter how good the tech is, if the measure's a problem, if it's WTO inconsistent, you're not going to be able to fix that. However, one thing, so I was the TBT delegate for the US for a long time, and one of the things that back in the day, one of the things that I often heard from businesses and I saw in the committee was that a lot of the cost is in the conformity assessment. That's where a lot of the cost is. So even if the measures are different, if you can align on the conformity assessment, you can cut down on the costs, and that can help, especially small companies, access multiple markets. And that's going to help developing countries even more. And one of the ways you do that is through standards, through international standards, and making sure that those standards are tech neutral and vendor neutral, that you build in interoperability, and that you make sure that it's as collaborative as possible. So the supply chain traceability standard that we're balloting right now it's a guide. It builds in a lot of different tech tools, but it recognizes that for different sectors and different use cases, they're all going to have different business logics. So you need to use them in different ways depending on the level of confidence you need, and the level of rigor that it depends if it's a regulator or the large purchaser needs. So you can use geospatial data if you want to show that a deforestation claim is still being met over time. You can use blockchain if you want to make sure that the documents that have been uploaded to a traceability platform, or where there's a link uploaded to the traceability platform, that those documents are authentic. At the same time, you can use AI because the documents may be authentic, but they still might not be accurate documents. So you can use AI to look at different groups of shipments to say, does this make sense? Does this make sense based on what we know about how that supply chain works? Does the timing match make sense? Do the quantities make sense? And then tracking devices. And again, we're technology neutral on that as well. So I think there's a lot that can be done, even when the underlying measures are problematic. And I think we just need to just deal with the fact that there's going to be some bifurcation. And at the same time, we can work through international standards to try to come up with systems that can, even in the face of those differences, make it as easy as possible for products to get to market, even where you may have to demonstrate different things to different regulators.
Amazing. Yeah, so just a short recap. I mean, TBTs and standards and quality infrastructure. This is all so exciting to me, so exciting, and it is to everybody on this call. So just a short recap. Usually, if you're not in the U.S., so usually regulations are rules-based. Standards are usually voluntary, and in quality infrastructure, and then there also says standards and regulations, and also then assessments. Which are the most important parts there. Emmanuel, let me throw you in here.
Yes, so your question was about the coolest thing, right, that tech can do. Now,
let's do
from
it.
Where I stand, the WTO, I mean, we have a global reach, and what we're trying to do is to monitor what's happening on a global scale. And so what is really exciting with technology now is that we can have access to real-time information on a global scale and really have a digital twin of global supply chains that is enabled by this end-to-end traceability. I mean, I've seen projects in that space that are just amazing. You can go to the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers and really see how supply chains evolve and pivot. And this is, I think it opens a whole range of new opportunities for companies, of course, but also for us at a more global level in terms of analytics. I think it's really the closest we've come to giving supply chains a digital nervous system in a way. So the combination of these different technologies is super powerful, and the real-time dimension is a game changer in my view.
Yes, and the transparency that offers is just mind-boggling now. It's so cool, so super cool. But you must be, I
Sure.
mean, what are you seeing on the ground? What
Okay,
are you
so
excited about?
yeah, well, I guess, I mean, just in broad strokes of what tech can and can't do, it can't create information that's not there, and it can't give good insight in the absence of quality inputs. We can't make something out of nothing. But it can bring order to chaos. It can preserve information that usually gets lost, and it can help us kind of find faces in clouds. It can do all of those things. And actually, kind of following, I think, a little on to what Emmanuel was saying, one of my favorite things that I get super excited about, which isn't actually core to what we do at Dore yet, but I think it will be in the future, and I just, I really like it from an intellectual perspective, is the increasing availability of open source data feeds that are useful for trade, supply chain kind of validation and understanding, like even just maritime data, right? Like there are a number of companies, and they do this very well, where they watch boats with satellites, and they scrape this information and package it well, and you end up with really rich data sets about maritime traffic. And that tells us about port congestion. It tells us what sorts of vessels are going where, which bulkers, because you can tell a lot about what's in a vessel by what type it is in many circumstances. And then when you start cross-referencing that with other publicly available data, like one thing that I was looking at with a colleague a couple of weeks ago was vessel traffic versus crack spreads, which is effectively that's what you get the profit margin from in a refinery. And so the lower the crack spread, the less money a refinery is making. And at some point, when those get too narrow, and that's like publicly available information effectively, because most refineries, people kind of know what's required as an input, and you get index prices. So you know what it produces, so you know how much money they're making, you know how much their main inputs cost. And you can start to see correlation between declining crack spreads in some geographies and the sort of vessel traffic that goes there. Because sometimes it's like driving to Spain to fill up your car with petrol if you live in Portugal. It's cheaper there. So you sometimes see that with vessel traffic as well. Like they'll go to different places for refueling if they have that room in their schedule, because it can make a lot of difference to the margins of the operators. And all this stuff that you think is kind of unrelated, you start to see really interesting patterns in data. And then if you combine that with proprietary data sources, you start to get really interesting insights. So I love that.
What's not to love? Well, all right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to get your things in the chat box. We're having so much fun here. So if you don't butt in, we're just going to keep having this conversation. So don't tell me I didn't ask you. There was room, because we always do run out of time. So is there anything, before we move on to the last point, what am I missing? What are you guys thinking? I mean, because you are experts in all of this and have spent so much time looking at both the big picture and the small picture. What is the one thing that you either wish that you knew, or that you wish that people knew that you know?
I've got an interesting one.
Yes, please.
And it's on supply chain traceability.
Yes.
And I think and this is perhaps an unpopular sentiment, but it's grounded in day-to-day reality. And that's, the more you diligence a supply chain, the more kind of brittle that becomes in a way, because a lot of supply chain due diligence, and this kind of goes to Jeff's example of, the one subcontractor of a T3 supplier, but that turned out to be in all of the upstream nodes. If they do something that's offside, that can affect everyone. And so a lot of supply chain due diligence right now is being done in a deep vertical way. But a lot of it is bilateral link, followed bilateral link, followed by bilateral link. And each of those is pretty manual, but then you can kind of automate things around that vertical series of linkages. But if you have one break in that and one change, it can be very difficult to then say, oh, I have traceability, because some of those are very fragile. And Emmanuel, I'm sure you have a lot on this topic as well.
Yeah, come on in. Thanks, Eva.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I was going to add, it's my point is slightly different, but in response to your question about what I think it's important that people know or that they wish to know, technology can do a lot of wonderful things. It can help to automate processes. It can help to gain in efficiency, transparency, etc. But if you don't do a bit of streamlining before you digitalize, you actually digitalize complexity. And that doesn't help. And I was talking to, and I won't mention the name of the company, but I was talking to someone who works in a big shipping company. It was a couple of weeks ago, and they were telling me that they have 120 different internal systems. You can digitalize that, but it's not going to help. So the big lesson is, if you want to digitalize, it can bring you a lot of benefits, but there's a lot of streamlining work that is needed before you do so, if you really want to reap the benefits of digitalization.
I completely underscore that. I don't know how many times I've seen people come in and say, we want to digitalize, and then you actually, we have to get a team member to sit with them and say, okay, well, what's your workflow? And it turns into this kind of bowl of spaghetti of, well, sometimes it's like this, unless it's like that, or if so-and-so looks at it, it might go like this. And these can be fairly large businesses with, revenues in the billions, but they're kind of very ad hoc. And it's this ad hoc that's been building and building and building until it's a beast with, 120 internal systems. And there hasn't been that introspection leading to a strategic vision for what are we doing here? And then it's kind of backing off the technology adoption to go back and say, okay, how do we streamline? How do we actually get a handle on what our process is, and how do sub-processes work together?
I think one level of complexity on top of that is when I think about writing standards and trying to make sure everyone's interconnected, the last thing I want to do is force everyone to use a particular technology solution, especially if everyone spent money developing all these redundant systems. They're not going to want to do that. It's going to make it harder to get people to adopt. So I wouldn't want to do that. I would hope that they would figure this out on their own. So from the standard side, I'd be interested if you have thoughts about how we could help with that, because I'd be nervous to say you have to switch to X, Y, or Z when some folks are still even using paper, and we're going to have to like provide an option for that until they move. The other thing, going back to Abba's point about, the break in the supply chain, those are just going to happen. These supply chains are too complicated. They're going to happen. And I think the question is, how do you respond? You need to have a policy in place for how you're going to respond when that happens. Because as soon as our client told us that, we said, you need to disclose this right now. You need to just stop doing what you're doing, disclose this right now, and say, we're going to put a plan together to fix this. Right? Not everyone reacted that way. There were other companies that waited until the customs service said, excuse me, what are you doing? And, not surprisingly, the ethical way of handling it and the legal way of handling it actually worked better. And so, but again, like there was a policy in place, and, that it was a textbook way of handling it. So I think that's always going to happen. You have to make sure you've qualified multiple suppliers And as long as you use
Oh,
those,
yes.
you're okay, and then you'll have some backups, but that's going to happen occasionally.
Qualify, multiply suppliers. That is important. I mean, because we see this now as tariffs are coming in. And so you might not even be able to use the same country as you used to have. And to what extent can tech solve that? I mean, because there's a difference between saying, hey, if you're used to doing this in Vietnam, here are a couple of others, suppliers that are in Vietnam, versus here are other suppliers that supply the thing that you're looking for globally. And here's some time, here's how you can shorten that time that it takes to build these relationships, because supply chains aren't built overnight, right? These take years or even decades.
Well, that was sort of the final point I wanted to get to, which is that policy can really help drive this. And again, it has to be good policy.
Yeah.
But a lot of the things that I see when we're trying to get data from different folks in the supply chain is they'll be hesitant to provide it. And sometimes they're hesitant to provide it because they don't want you to know what the markup is, or they're a competitor, or they don't want you to know something. And so there are ways of safeguarding the data.
Yes.
And again, like this needs to be done by the private sector. Agencies need to delegate this to the private sector. So whenever I go into the Commerce Department for a meeting, they give me a sticker and they write a number on the sticker and they write down in a little ledger that I was there, and then you put the sticker on and it falls off. That's the level of technology going into the US Commerce Department. At the Department of Energy, they take your picture and then the picture is always a silhouette. And then when you walk
Light
into the
sources
building,
behind you.
a guard is looking at your face and looking at the silhouette to make sure that silhouette is actually you. So this is the level of technology. So I don't think government agencies should be doing tech. They should be delegating to the private sector, third-party standards. There are a whole suite of ISO standards to help qualify the traceability platforms and auditors and others that could be used for these types of schemes. That's how it should work. But that is the primary issue here is the private sector needs to help, but the policy needs to actually require this information. It shouldn't be for if a client has to go to another upstream supplier and say, I need this information, and they're just going to say no unless the requirements are clear that the product can't come in without that information. And that has to be enforced. That's the best way of actually getting this traceability. It shouldn't be for a government to have to prove a negative, right? If they can't, I mean, a lot of the requirements that I'm looking at now are not just origin requirements, but they're ownership requirements, they're control requirements, right? This whole foreign entity of concern approach in a lot of US regulations now. And the bottom line is that, if the government can't tell whether or not you're in compliance, the default should be that you're not. Obfuscation of your supply chain so that you can hide whether it's forced labor or you're not showing the actual carbon content, whatever it is, the default should be you can't meet this. You can't meet this requirement. It shouldn't be for a government to have to chase down and prove a negative because you've effectively made sure that none of this information can be accessed. There's got to be a way of doing it where there are privacy and BCI protections in place. I know that's doable. So I think the policy needs to drive this. The question is it going to be good policy? And is the government going to allow qualified, neutral third parties to do this work using up-to-date tech tools so that it can stay evergreen?
That is a fantastic point. So I'm going to, first of all, no wonder, because you had a colleague come in there with 4 legs. So you had a dog, right? Come in there. which we
Yeah,
appreciate.
Yes, that was Scarlett. She desperately wanted to be on camera.
We loved that. Love that. But before Emmanuel, can I just add one more thing to these questions as we go around? What the French do we do about papers? Like, how do we solve that everlasting problem with papers? Emmanuel, go ahead. And Scarlett, obviously, if she has an answer.
Okay, yeah, I was going to react to a point that Jeffrey made, but I will bring that dimension of paper in my response. So Jeffrey talked about requirements that governments should put in place. I think there are two levels of policy intervention. I mean, you have the requirements, but you also have the fact that governments should be putting in place a conducive ecosystem. So it's more incentivization in a way by putting in place regulatory sandboxes, for example, to test new approaches. Abba was talking about data. They can put in place open government data strategies to improve accessibility to data, which can be important, especially for small companies. A number of governments are thinking about putting in place, for example, supercomputers to give access to SMEs to computing power so that they can develop their own AI tools and AI systems. So giving those small companies that are struggling, I mean, big companies, they're already using tech, but how do we bring the small players on board? Infrastructure can be, shared infrastructure can be a solution. So there's a lot that government can do to foster adoption of technology and make technology more inclusive and through that more powerful. And then back to your question, Hannah, there's also the importance of the regulatory framework and legal framework. So standards are one aspect of it, but when we talk about cross-border paperless trade, there is also an enabling legal framework that is needed in order to support that move, because you need to be able to recognize electronic documents. I mean, you can use the digital technology, digitalize your document, but if it's not being recognized, then you can't go very far, right? So there are certain laws that need to be put in place, or certain legal framework that needs to be in place. So when it comes to paperless trade, it's Melita compliant legislation. So legislation compliant with the UNCTRA model on electronic transferable records that has a number of requirements to give electronic documents the same characteristics, I would say, as paper in terms of like control, singularity, uniqueness, etc. So that legal framework is critically important and should be seen as an enabler of digitalization. Very often, you know, regulation is seen more as a stick, and but I think it's very important to think of regulation as an enabler to promote digitalization. But this brings me to the second point that I wanted to make, which is that it's important for national governments to put in place a conducive legal framework and the right regulations. But what we see is a risk of fragmentation. We see it very well in the case of AI, for example. We just published a report in November last year on AI in trade, and we see a race to regulate AI with different approaches that are not necessarily in sync. And we see that for digital trade in general. Data localization requirements or measures and data flows have been increasing and are impeding digital trade. And so that brings me to the last point, which is the importance of global alignment on these issues and global dialogue on these issues. And this is where multilateral organizations like the WTO can play a role, because we provide a forum for exchange of information to raise specific concerns when there are concerns. So we had discussions, for example, on the EU AI Act that were raised by members. And these discussions are useful to try and avoid a move to disputes. And of course, through new rules that are being put in place. Now, you were mentioning paperless trade. A group of 71 members are sponsoring a text and agreement on e-commerce. We have a stabilized text that was published last year. And one of the provisions of that text is on adoption of Melita compliant legislation. So it's not a multilateral text, it's a plurilateral text, but nevertheless, it provides a framework, a plurilateral framework to try and drive some alignment at a level that goes beyond the national level, beyond the regional level, not yet global yet, we hope that at some point it will become global, but provides this framework to try and align positions and approaches on these issues.
Totally agree. Abba, you've got the last point of the day.
Okay. I guess in broad strokes, I love Emmanuel's point of use regulation as an enabler, because that is, hugely important, because the counterpoint is using regulation to kind of create gateways and roadblocks, which in the technology landscape, a lot of innovation comes from smaller innovators, and they don't have legal teams, they don't have compliance specialists. So if regulation is not an enabler, but is rather creating roadblocks, then those smaller innovators they can't face it. So they say, well, we'll skip that market. And then that market ends up underserved. So regulation as an enabler rather than a roadblocker is hugely important. Then publish good statistics. There are tons of industrious people out there hunting for good data to feed analytical engines. I'm sitting in London today. The UK has started to have a real problem with publishing good statistics, and that scares me. Because when statistics are really stale or they're not good quality, that makes it really difficult to trust them and to work with them. Last one, whenever government bodies build technology infrastructure, keep a sharp eye on the implementation.
Yeah.
Build things that people can work with. And that goes beyond good standards. Like, good standards is necessary, but not sufficient. You've got to have thoughtful standards. Those have to be actually deployed through government systems that face the world. But those systems have to provide rails for private solutions providers to integrate with. So we need to be, ideally good APIs that are maintained with good documentation. Because if that's not there, it's just creating another friction point, which can be difficult to overcome, because those things are often budgeted. The work gets done. It's being contracted. The contractors down tools and leave, and then it's not properly maintained.
Yes.
There's no one to talk to. It's a dead instrument.
Fantastic. I mean, this could go on and on and on. I am just loving this conversation. So for those of you who are loving these conversations as much as I do, first of all, if there's another topic for Curated that you would like to suggest that we do, please reach out. For this one in particular, we're super grateful to PepsiCo and to Global Affairs Canada, who gave us this opportunity for this amazing, fantastic conversation. So reach out on that. If you're loving digital, then we're actually going to continue a conversation in Geneva in person at the WTO on June 10th. And so, but without further ado, I'm just going to say thank you so much, Abba. Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, Jeff and Scarlett. And thank you, Yana and Sarah, and all of the TradeExperettes volunteers who have made all of this possible. And I hope that we are all emerging a little bit wiser and a little bit more excited about the opportunities that are actually out there. It's so important to turn regulation on its head and say that there are really important opportunities in here too. So really grateful for all your time here and for all that comes in here. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.